Beyond the Wrench with Jay Goninen from Find a Wrench.
All right. I am really excited about today's podcast and really just kind of being able to dive into what the maybe some of the barriers or some of the things that we see with parts and service and the relationship there. And today I'm really excited to bring on Kaylee Felio from PartsEdge. How are you, Kaylee?
I'm doing great, and I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. We had some fun discussions prior to the podcast and coming up with ideas of what would be really beneficial to our audience to learn about, and really kind of trying to tear apart those silos between parts and service, I think is a big deal. But before we get started on the actual content, tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get into this industry?
Yeah, it's a funny story. I was a manager at a Subway restaurant, and the founders of PartsEdge were my regular customers. So I think they saw something in me and offered a position, and I took it because I wasn't quite sure if I wanted to go to college or what I wanted to do. So I learned the operation side of PartsEdge and what we do for our clients. Left and did some other things because I always ultimately knew I kind of wanted to be in sales and marketing. And then when it opened up at PartsEdge, I just jumped on it because I always knew that's what I wanted to do there, and really help get the message across and what we do for dealerships. So
how long have you been with PartsEdge?
I think overall it's probably been about 10 years.
Good for you.
Sales 5. Yeah.
So from sandwich artist to sales, like you got like that, got the spread there. But in all seriousness, I think, I was talking to somebody about this the other day, and some of those jobs do such a good job at preparing you for, going into a role that you're in right now, right? Like some of the stuff that you learned at Subway, I'm sure translated really nicely into what you're doing today.
Oh, definitely. Just the relationships, customers, employees, how to really, work with all different types of personalities. And it's funny too, when I was learning PartsEdge and kind of they were explaining the industry, and when I first started, they would always relate it back to Subway terms for me because we essentially did manage an inventory. I mean, it was food, it was a lot different, but it was just, that's how things were explained to me a lot.
Well, but there's parallels, right? And like in a business where, inventory is probably tougher in the restaurant industry, just because if you don't use it immediately,
it does go bad.
You're out of luck. Like and so being able to predict what you need to order and what you need to, to keep your customers happy, I'm sure is a big challenge.
Definitely. Yeah. It was, if we had something like PartsEdge for Subway, it would have been a lot easier.
So once you got into the industry and started kind of feeling your way through it, assuming you liked being in the business and liked kind of where you were going with PartsEdge?
Yeah, I liked it. I was, I left and did real estate for a little bit, and that was kind of sales. That kind of gave me the sales and marketing that I kind of wanted to learn outside of the auto industry. But it was like I couldn't leave it. It was like I left and then I just kept coming back. Yeah.
I think that's common in our industry, right? Like I've been in this business my entire life, and I don't think it's really ever dawned on me to like go try something different, even, which might not be the greatest thing in the world, but I do think it's got stickiness to it. And once you get into the industry and start to know people in the industry, and even from a technician level, I have a lot of friends to this day from when I was a technician that are still really, really good friends. And it wasn't like I was proactively trying to network. It was just people that thought similar to me and that, we had the same interests. So I think once you get into it and you start to know other people, those relationships make it harder and harder to get out.
Yeah. Well, and the opportunity with the industry is so huge. It's just amazing what you can do with them. So I always push everyone to kind of take a look at the auto industry. Like I pushed my husband to be a parts manager because I always knew his personality would be really good at it. Yeah, and my right hand person at Subway actually works at PartsEdge now. Back then, so I introduced her to PartsEdge, and she
Wow.
hasn't left the whole time. Like, I left a couple of times, but she stayed with PartsEdge the whole time.
It's like, wait a minute, Kaylee, where are you going? You brought me on here now.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about what you do at PartsEdge.
So I'm responsible for bringing on new dealerships, the marketing, just getting the word out of what we do at PartsEdge, and just building the relationships. So that's mainly what I focus on. And then once a dealership signs on, I continue the relationship, but essentially hand them off to the team to execute everything that needs to be executed.
And what is it that needs to be executed? What is it that PartsEdge does, and it really, how are you helping dealerships with their kind of parts inventory and their parts headaches?
We are a tool for parts managers. That's the best way to put it. We have ways to make it so that they're more proactive with their DMS, and just helping them save time and making sure that they're, I guess the best way to explain it and what we can do is we have the ability to set up 50 to 100 sources. And I think most parts managers know that with that, you can become more granular with the way you stock parts, the way you phase them in and out, pricing, your manufacturer programs. That's a lot for a parts manager without a tool to help maintain that. So typically parts managers can execute and have a great inventory with less sources, but we kind of take it to that next level and help them save time and have a more proactive and productive inventory.
And you do that using like analytics, AI, kind of a combination of everything?
Yeah, we utilize the existing DMS, really just knowing the things that need to get done every day automatically for parts managers to save them time. So yeah, that's how we do it.
It's really cool. I mean, when we talked about the product in general, prior to getting on the podcast, I was really impressed, and I've got some parts background as well, and that is a true headache. Inventory in and of itself is it's so impactful to a dealership, and being able to manage the inventory so you've got the right inventory at the right time is, at times, I almost felt like impossible, because you'd have people yelling at you, and like both from the parts counter folks that are getting it, maybe they're given a hard time by a customer that's wanting something today, or maybe a technician that's wanting it today. So there's a lot of variables, and I think that segues really nicely into our conversation for today, which is really how we improve relationships between parts and service personnel within a dealership. And I think, we'll start with that piece right there, which is there's sometimes a struggle for maybe a technician to understand, why we don't have a part, or why we don't, why we can't get a part, to be on the shelf consistently. And when I say that, maybe it's a common job that they have that they're doing, and they're just they're not seeing that the parts department is delivering on that. And that can be really frustrating, because they're trying to put out time, and they're trying, especially in our business, where that customer is wanting that vehicle back as soon as possible in most cases. Tell us a little bit about that part of it. And when I say that, what is it that a technician needs to understand about the parts department that maybe they don't?
Well, I guess we could go back to like the parts, like what can a parts person do to understand the tech? I think I want to start there.
Yeah. Let's start there.
Yeah. And that's how they can, understanding the product, understanding the catalog, that can only be learned through experience. So as a dealership as a whole, like understanding that maybe if you have newer people that are less experienced, giving them the time to understand and not put so much pressure on them, I guess, because it does take time to understand the catalog. And then the tech, understanding that, of course, bringing the VIN to them so it can wean out, and then just understanding their product and the parts that they need, and not having like, well, I think it could be 5 of these parts, so just order all 5 of them. It's like, that doesn't make sense for the parts operation to order all 5. We need to kind of dial down and really getting the right part. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, it does. And I think what I took out of that is that there's still a pretty big barrier in communication between a parts and a service person, right? And really an understanding from both sides of what the other's job is. I think it's easy for a parts person to maybe understand what a technician's job is because it's what's ever in their stall, they've got to get out and they need parts in order to do that. But maybe maybe the tech doesn't see it, maybe that doesn't have that understanding as much on the other side.
Yeah, and how much work it takes to do the inventory management, to test parts. Like if it's a part that is a productive part that keeps selling and you're continuously not having it, having the extra source or something set up to really test and then you can phase it in and stock it. Working together as a team to identify those opportunities to start phasing in those parts, and don't get mad if it's the first time. Like give it a chance to test and make sure that that's what we need to stock. And then the other thing I wanted to say about the text too, like for a parts person to understand, them sitting at the counter and waiting and working with you and then you not having the part, that's their wasted time. There's a car on the lift and then they have to take the car down. Like that's a lot of wasted time. Yeah. So working through if you don't have experienced parts people, working through that training process of them understanding and getting more experience, to really understand what the tech's going through.
Well, and so out of your program, is a parts person seeing the typical like parts turns, give me an idea of like the responsibility of a counter person versus a manager when it comes to inventory in general. In my experience, it was a lot of, maybe the individual parts person or counter person didn't have a ton of influence on the inventory. It was more of the manager it was their role to be able to really manage that inventory, or maybe at some dealerships having an actual inventory manager whose job is just to make sure that they have the right parts on hand. How much do you see parts counter people getting into actual inventory discussions?
It varies on dealership, honestly. Yeah. I'd say they do have an important role for the inventory because they are more interactive with the techs and really seeing what's getting demand. Yeah. So like as a counter person, just identifying those opportunities of like, hey, this is a constant part and we continue like don't have it. Maybe we need to, or like have a system where if it continues to come up, they just automatically know where to put it so that it can begin to get tested, kind of thing, so that it's not like a ordeal. It's just a process.
What role does emotion play in parts inventory? Like, and when I say that, like if you've got a technician that's constantly chewing you out, it's hard for it not to become kind of a factor. But do you see emotion playing a role in inventory at all?
I mean, that can, yeah. There's gut feelings of when you should stock a part. I think that's a lot of time that happens with parts managers because they're in this reactive state because they're not just inventory managers, they're managing employees, manufacturer programs, they're spread so thin, especially now. It's like I'm hearing more and more parts managers are actually working the counter and doing shipping and receiving. Like they're just running all over the place. And that can happen with just being reactive because you're all running all over the place.
Yeah. And that makes it really hard. I think that's where a tool like you guys are offering is so helpful because it takes away some of the pressure of, having to try and stay on top of numbers. And granted, I think as a parts manager, inventory manager, it's so vital to just have your finger on the pulse of where your inventory is at. And I think that's one of the misconceptions that maybe techs don't fully grasp is how important a parts inventory and managing a parts inventory is to the overall health of a dealership. Yeah. So when we talk about that, we see that becoming, that's been a huge issue with a lot of dealerships for a long time, where if they don't have somebody that's really, really good at managing their parts inventory, it can quickly get out of hand. And then you end up with a bunch of obsolete parts. You end up with, basically inventory just collecting dust that is, you've paid for, and now you're not going to get a return on it.
Yeah, and then you have the operations kind of working against each other because you have this inexperienced parts operation, but maybe you have experienced techs and you're wasting their time, and then you might lose them because you're wasting their time.
Yeah,
So it's
yeah,
just,
and it
yeah,
impacts their paycheck. I mean, at the
exactly.
end of the
That's
day,
what.
like, yeah, if they're paid on flat rate, they're not wanting to sit around too often and chat. They want the part and they want to get their job done.
Yeah.
But that's where I think we could provide a lot of understanding to technicians, is that, by putting obsolete parts or leaving obsolete parts on a shelf, and that can easily happen if you have a run, and say, even like with analytics, if you have maybe a run of 3 of a part and you hadn't sold it prior to that in the 6 months prior or the 12 months prior, and then understanding that maybe those 3 were unique one-off type of things that just happened to be coincidental that it all happened at one time.
Mhm.
I always saw it from my end, where maybe a parts manager that only studied numbers would then they'd bring in another 3 of those, and then you wouldn't see that repair again for another 12 months. And so, having that part sit there is really hurtful for the dealership, because then they're not able to stock those really, really needed parts. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, definitely. They're wasting the resources and money on those obsolete parts or idle inventory parts, and where they should be, stocking the more productive, active parts. And then another thing for techs to realize too is the parts manager is managing a manufacturer program that is recommending for them what to stock, and sometimes they don't always need to stock what they're recommending. Just because they got one hit doesn't mean they need to stock it.
Right.
And just understanding that they're managing that process too, and they're managing the returns to make sure that they're staying on top of returns, and then special orders too, because I know every dealership has special orders. There's not really a way around it. And really outlining a process to manage the special orders, just because the parts manager ordered it in doesn't mean it's gonna go to the customer. We got to have a process.
So do you get, like, when you're dealing with your customers directly, do you get into fill rates and that kind of stuff in turns, like, as far as, like, so when I say that, what is a typical fill rate, like, that of a part that's in stock?
Like a percentage, like an average
Yeah.
percentage fill rate. I think it ranges on make, but I think when the last study that we did, I want to say it was like 85% to
Makes sense.
95% fill rates.
Depending on the manufacturer.
Yeah, depending on the manufacturer and the way that your DMS is set up, because your fill rate can be different based on like wholesale or your different avenues of doing business kind of thing.
Sure.
It's not just one whole. And then inventory turns, that has been a huge topic that we've talked about too, because it's inventory turns isn't as important as gross inventory turns. We recently actually wrote a blog about it. So,
Nice.
So I'm glad you mentioned that.
So what do you mean by that? Like, so when you say gross inventory turns, what does that mean?
It's so complicated. I don't want to take up the whole. You just have to read the article.
Yeah.
But I would say like the inventory turns, and that is, again, it ranges on manufacturer, but the average is, I think it was like 8 to 9 turns was
Wow.
a year, was probably a good. But if you're doing too much, you're
Low on inventory.
You're turning too much, it's not good. Turning too low, that's not good too. You kind of have to find a happy medium. So
Right.
hopefully.
Right. Well, and for a technician that's sitting out there, this would be a question I would have for my dealership: is what do those turns look like? Because as Kaylee said, you might have a legitimate gripe if the turns are really, really high, because that means they don't have, they're not churning that inventory as much. And when we talk about inventory turn, we're talking about total dollar amount of parts that's turned in a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So total inventory. So say if you've got, I don't know, $3 million in inventory and you turn that 3 times, you know, that's probably maybe a little bit low.
Yeah,
as far
that's
as
low.
that turn. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's been a while since I've been on the part side of things, but I do remember thinking, you know, being able to gauge that inventory turn was such a big deal. And for, you know, if I'm in a technician's shoes right now, being able to understand that piece of it is so critical to your understanding of a parts department and how it runs in general, right? And what those KPIs for a parts manager are, because that could help you understand. And if you've got a gripe with the inventory and you think that, hey, we don't have these parts when we need them, being able to sit down with maybe your service manager or fixed ops director, and hopefully if you've got a good fixed ops director, they can sit down and kind of they can paint the picture for you of what that looks like. And I think rather than getting super frustrated about it, being able to have that conversation with somebody can really it can save your emotional toll, or save the emotional toll that it takes on a technician when they don't understand that.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that kind of leads into like the personality, knowing the personalities of parts, the
Yes.
typical personality. Yeah, because it's like you have to ask it in a right way. If you're constantly complaining about not having the right parts, you're gonna I want to say hurt their feelings, but you're gonna offend them. They work very hard. Parts managers work very hard to have and maintain that inventory. So if you're constantly complaining, it's like, you know, telling someone that their baby's ugly.
That's so true. Parts managers take this very seriously, and that is
And
their
that's okay.
baby.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's their baby.
that's funny.
Yeah. I know I ran into that when I'm like talking to them about what PartsEdge can do, and they're just like, what? You're gonna help me? I already do this job. Like, no, I'm just gonna help you do it better.
Well, and I think everybody, if technology can help you maintain a better parts inventory to make those techs happier and make your dealer principal happier because they're not sitting on an extra $1 million in inventory that they don't need. You know, I think if it can make your life easier, you should take full advantage of it.
Yeah, exactly.
So how about that piece of it, the personality side? Let's dive into that a little bit.
Yeah.
What I found in my experience is a lot of times maybe a parts manager doesn't have, they tend to be maybe a little bit more type A, analytical. They really, you know, that's what makes a good parts manager. They're looking at numbers. They're able to be able to manage a lot of part numbers. Like I don't think some people understand how many part numbers go into some of these systems, and being able to manage that it can be really overwhelming. So I think at times when a technician comes storming through the door and says, where in the hell is my stuff at? Why don't we have any of this stuff? That the parts manager ends up being very defensive. And a lot of times because of their personality, maybe they're not the most outgoing person in the world. And I don't want to put all parts managers in the same bucket.
No.
But I do think there's some level of this, maybe a little bit of a drier personality. And when I say that, that's not as an insult or a slight to parts managers. It's more just kind of, it makes them good at what they are, or, you know, that they're really good at managing numbers. And so where technicians on the other side can be a little bit more boisterous, it feels like, or at least a few in each shop are boisterous. How do we improve that relationship? Like, I think it starts with the communication that you talked about already. But how do we get it to the point to where it's not just a tense conversation 100% of the time?
Yeah, communication, definitely. I always like to say this, and it's if there's an opportunity to kind of have them not swap, but like shadow each other.
Oh,
to,
yeah.
Kind of like live in their, put yourself in someone else's shoes and like really see what each person has to deal with. And And then that, I feel like that gives people more of an understanding, because I know that I personally like to shadow parts managers and like really understand what they're dealing with. I mean, luckily it's easy for me because my husband's a parts manager, so I'm like,
Yeah.
hey, can I shadow you? But it really has opened my eyes a lot more of what parts managers have to deal with. So I know techs obviously cannot sit by a parts manager all day long, but if there's an opportunity to kind of an hour or so or something, just to get the idea of what they're dealing with.
I've got a good story about that, of somebody that did that.
Sure.
And it was so cool because it was a tech that was that I was managing, and they went in and they had been frustrated with the parts inventory for a while, and it was super frustrating to them. And we were open on Saturdays, so what would happen is that the techs would get every other Saturday off. And this particular tech went out of his way to ask the parts manager if he could come sit with him on a Saturday that they worked opposite, Saturdays. So like he wasn't on the clock, it wasn't affecting his paycheck. And I don't expect every tech to just go in on a Saturday when they're not working. But the initiative I saw in somebody that just went out of their way to go sit with a parts manager, and the parts manager being willing to sit down and show them inventories and walk through a lot of things, it helped their relationship out of a bunch. And not only that, I think the impact that had when that tech went back into the shop and then heard other techs complaining about parts inventory, that he could talk to them and be able to explain it and at least have some knowledge of what the parts manager does.
Definitely. I think that's so cool that he did that. And I don't think every tech needs to do it. I think if you're finding that there's a problem and try and step outside the box and shadow and get an understanding, because the parts manager is managing, one of the largest assets at the dealership. The dealer actually has their money invested in this inventory. So
and it's a lot of money. It is a substantial amount of money. So there's a huge opportunity there. I also think there's a huge opportunity for the service manager to get involved, or if the fixed ops director is seeing both sides of it and trying to get some cross training in there and looking at different opportunities to have them do that. And same thing goes for a service manager. If you can get a service manager to go sit with a parts manager and not talk about, oh, hey, you didn't have this part for Larry last week. What happened? And like, have it be more like, hey, I want to get an understanding of this stuff so I can explain it to my team. I think a lot of it is in the approach, right? Like, like how you interact with a parts person from the service end is so vital. And if you come in hot and you're not happy, that's not the greatest time to have that discussion. You need to have it when you can sit down and really just be able to decipher and understand what it is that a parts manager does.
Mm-hmm. I 100% agree.
Yeah. And I think the other way too, right? If you can get the parts people out with technicians, even if they're helping them, clean up or do whatever in the shop, just in general, relationship building and getting them out of their comfort zone and into a shop, I think that can be really beneficial.
Yeah, and then that not even just the parts manager, like all of the parts people, because I think that can give them more. Because I know I'm a visual learner, so learning the catalog on a computer might be very, cumbersome and just like that's a lot. But if a tech took the time to like show, like this is what I'm looking at physically, that I think gives more of an understanding, just taking that extra time, because especially if you're dealing with an inexperienced parts person, that gives them the experience and showing them. So
yeah, that helps out at the front counter too, when you're dealing with just a straight parts customer, that they have an understanding of what they're talking about. And I've been on a parts counter before when I don't fully understand the catalog, and it is brutal. Like, and if it's busy, if the parts counter is busy, it is extremely challenging. There's a lot of pressure there, and people are expecting expecting you to have an answer for them right away, and they're not the most patient people in the world. So that there's a lot of pressure on a parts counter person.
Yeah, especially if the customer is impatient and you have your coworkers being an impatient. My mom's a parts counter person, so my whole family.
Nice.
So I get to hear her stories about just like, because she's never really done it, and she's familiar with her dad was a mechanic, or my grandpa was a mechanic, but she's like, the catalog is just so hard to learn.
Right. And there's staffing issues there too, right? So if you get behind the eight ball on the parts counter and you're short people, that ends up making you throw people into the fire a lot faster, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And some people, it can wear them out. So appreciating those people that are getting thrown to the fire.
My limited time on a parts counter. Yeah, my limited time on a parts counter definitely wore me out. That was that is definitely a challenge. So when we talk about this, and we're trying to explain maybe inventory, or trying to explain this to a technician, say that parts manager sitting down with a technician, how do you get that piece of the inventory itself, right? Like, so you're sitting down and you say, okay, we've got whatever, $3 million worth of inventory here. I think what happens a lot of times, at least what I had seen, was that people's eyes kind of gloss over and they're like, yeah, that's a lot of money, but I don't know like how that applies to me, or, are you able to paint the bigger picture of what this is? I mean, when you're sitting down and talking to them and they see this big number, which, most of us don't have $3 million to throw at parts inventory, and they just see it as like this big dealership, that has all this money that can throw it around. But in reality, inventory can sink a dealership. I mean, if you have bad inventory, it can put you out of business.
Yeah, because you're essentially not having the right parts. No, I'm glad you brought that up. I know the DMSs can produce this. There's manager reports. You can see what's going on. It's just, you got to pull a lot of reports, and you got to figure out how to, I guess, dive deeper in understanding what you're looking at. That's why at PartsEdge, we created a simplified way to really see what's going on with the inventory on one page. So we break it up into the key categories: your productive, active parts that are selling, your excess, your forced, your technical obsolescence, and then your obsolescence. And we do 13 months no sell, 13 months no receipt for our what we categorize as obsolescence. But your technical obsolescence, I think that was Nichols. What was his name?
Which one?
Nichols. He was a parts. Why can't I think of his first name? Oh my gosh. But he thought of the term technical obsolescence. It's going to come to me after this, but that's what's coming at you. That's going to be obsolescence. So if you're not accruing $5,000 every month, then your obsolescence is going to grow at $5,000 kind of thing. That's just an example. But that's, seeing that, for like a tech to be able to see that and understand, like, okay, this forced category, that's kind of where the techs can fall in. Of they're wanting these parts and kind of forcing the inventory because they're essentially special orders all the time. So that's the category that they might care about, and seeing that percentage and seeing how high it is. Maybe they want to work with the parts manager to get it at a lower percentage, or set a goal of, whatnot. And then the parts team also having a system in place to manage those special orders too. So that, because it's not all up to the tech to get the parts on the.
I love that, because even if you're not using something as useful as PartsEdge, what you had there, what you talked about there, was simplifying the data, so you're not going through this big thick inventory, bunch of sheets. And being able to dive into that. If you can simplify it and be able to show them, okay, this is our turn rate. This is why turn rate is important. This is what a good turn rate looks like. This is where we're at.
And this is our fill rate. Yeah.
This is our fill rate. And, obviously I think maybe one of the funny parts is that at a foundational level, there's times where a tech thinks that the parts people are out to get them because they didn't fill the, but they're judged on fill rate. Like I mean, that is one of their key performance indicators is fill rate. And so
Mhm.
it's in their best interest to have the part for you, because if they
Yeah.
don't, it reflects poorly on them, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and also I think, did we touch on pay plans too? I think making sure that like parts is paid off the whole and vice versa, kind of like combining, because I think when you're paid off of all the different departments, you work better as a team. I
Yeah,
think. I mean, because essentially it boils down to, we're all trying to make money. So
right. So how
yeah.
does that look like when you're trying to tie everybody together on a pay plan?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen dealerships do it so different, all different levels, but essentially parts getting paid off service, and I've seen even a small percentage on labor, like the hours for techs too. So
So that
that's
you're
like
rewarding them for efficiency and productivity of getting, the faster you can get them parts, the faster they move and are able to get cars out the door.
exactly, and then even creating a system where I know resources are low, but pulling parts for them, and so that they're not having to come to the counter, and just creating a system for that too is super helpful on just being more efficient.
I don't know if it was you or somebody told me this. Oh no, I was at a big truck dealership actually, and they actually got a golf cart that had like a truck box on it, and their parts people, and they have a gigantic shop, so like
I
that
would
was part of
imagine.
the reason. But
Yeah.
they have a golf cart that actually the parts people use to run the parts so they could do it
That's
faster
cool.
and handle, because if you get a big parts order and you're doing a big job, having to haul all of that out to wherever the technician's bay is can be really time consuming for
Yeah.
the parts person. But then it just doesn't make it as clean. So, I love when people think outside the norm of how you get parts out to a technician. And I think there's a lot of efficiency to be had there. If
Yeah.
at a dealership, you're able to think that through and again just have some type of urgency of getting those parts out to a tech. And I think maybe that's where, going back to the relationship side, where techs can get frustrated is if they don't see that enthusiasm with a parts person that's delivering the parts. And as stupid as that sounds,
Yeah.
it can be frustrating if you see that person and they're like, they kind of go out and throw it in your bay and just kind of take off like.
Like whatever. Yeah.
Right. Like I think there's so much that could be gained by parts people understanding that service business as well,
Mhm.
and really knowing that your job is important, and the faster you can get it out to them, the faster they can get stuff done, and having the right parts too, because I think that's another area where I've seen it where parts people are delivering parts to a tech, but they're the wrong part, or they didn't pick it right, or something was wrong, so then the tech ends up having to go back into the parts department, and that causes even more friction, and
Mhm.
everybody's pissed off.
Yes. Yeah. I think reviewing your what you have going on the day, like before kind of the day starts, and making sure you did get those parts in, so that you can identify like, oh, this customer's coming in and we don't have this part, so that you can coordinate and tell the service so that they can handle that, and the techs know like what not to expect. And then just, every department's bit different. Like the bigger ones I've seen have like a whole, like a literally a machine that like gets the parts for
Yeah,
them. And then
yeah.
I've seen just like, the smaller operations where it's like one person in the operation. They're, doing all the different roles, and just getting the parts for them that they can. It just helps tremendously, I think. And
One person. I hope their techs are patient with them. That would be a challenge.
yeah, definitely. No, I think it's good.
So like we're getting close to the end here of the podcast, and I
I
just
can
kind of
believe
want
it.
to, well, and I kind of want to, we've talked a lot about relationships and how important they are to build. And I know a lot of techs, that's not what they want to hear, that they have to spend time kind of growing those relationships, or, they just want to go in, a lot of them, and do their job and do it well and leave. And I think what I hope lands out of this is that it's worth your time to build that relationship with a parts person, and it's worth going out of your way. And even if you're an introvert and you don't want to talk to other people when you go to work, that, and I have days where I'm that way, so I totally get it. But investing the time to be able to actually have a relationship with somebody, so that when you do run into a difficult spot, that you can work together and work your way out of it, and hopefully it doesn't happen again.
Mhm.
And really, even being able to ask a smart question from a technician standpoint, I think if we're able to arm a tech with good questions to be able to go back and ask a parts team about, rather than storming in the door and yelling,
Mhm.
what advice would you give, like, to a technician, like a question to ask a parts team or a parts department? Like, and when I say that, as you're trying to get an understanding and you're trying to, you're trying to build those relationships, what should they be talking about?
I think understanding the inventory, so asking them about like what their goals are, what what are they looking at as a whole in the operation, so that they're understanding like what effects that the tech has on their day to day and the inventory. So like I mentioned, the force category, just understanding if you're having a lot of special orders, um, that's a lot to manage, and so we need to come up with a plan so you're not constantly having special orders. So yeah, just understanding the inventory, asking about it, and then just be patient too. Like if you recognize that a parts person is a parts manager or just a parts counter person is newer, be patient with them, let them learn, show them. I think a lot of people learn visually, so take the time, and don't like try and pull fast one on them to like see if they know or understand. Like obviously they're learning. Let's give them some time. So
Yeah,
I think
and
that would be my advice.
that comes along, a similar message that I've had for techs in the past is, you want to get paid more, you want to be more respected in the industry. This is your craft. Like, be professional with that person, be accommodating for that person. I had a veteran tech that worked for me that was brilliant at that would bring somebody to the side and say, hey, you know what, I know you're new, I want to help you out, like, come follow me for a couple days and I'll kind of show you the ropes. And they had a great relationship, and it was a young parts person with an older technician, and
That's
it
awesome.
was so cool to see that dynamic of people working together. And we talk so much about generational gaps and how difficult it is for uh, anybody to deal with millennials, right? And so I'm
I don't
actually,
know if I'm quite a millennial. I don't know.
I'm on the front end of the millennial group. I'm
Yeah,
technically a millennial, yeah.
yeah.
But the like, to see somebody that was acting like a true professional and was extending the olive branch so that they could help impact somebody's life to make their life easier. I think techs at times don't fully understand or grasp how much of an impact they can have on other people in a dealership. And
Yeah.
if they can just open up their eyes a little bit to that part and be accommodating to that young person so that you can train them the right way. I would look at, I would encourage techs to look at it that exact way, is that you have a young person that you can help shape into the type of person that can really, really benefit you moving forward. And it's kind of like that blank slate, right? You can help them paint that picture of what it is that's going to help you. And rather than being just a dick to them and
Yeah.
having and having constant turnover behind the parts counter, if you can invest 6 months into somebody in being patient and showing them how to do it,
They probably
I
won't
think
leave.
it's going to make your life easier, right?
Yeah, because I think when you get experience and experience together, you create this like not a monster, not a bad
It's a
monster, just
powerhouse.
a
Yeah.
powerhouse. Yeah, that's a great. Yeah, you create a powerhouse. So
Yeah.
I remember the founder of Chuck PartsEdge. He said one of his experience was he was like, once I got my team where it was like everyone was so experienced and they just kind of worked together. He was like he had the largest Chrysler point in the world back when he was a parts manager, managing largest wholesale. Like that shows when you can put time and effort into your people to understand and the experience, then you can create a powerhouse.
You do. And I think whether we want to admit it or not as an industry, when a technician does that, like it's really easy for a parts person to play favorites, right? And they won't say it, they won't ever talk about it, but they'll go that extra mile for that tech that treats them right and is respected. And, I
Yeah.
think that's huge.
It's huge. Essentially, it's a customer. Like it's developing a relationship and you're building that relationship with them. So, you're accommodating and showing them, then they're going to accommodate back and they're going to, maybe play favorites.
So let's take that from the other side then. Advice or questions from a parts person's point of view to a technician. Like if you had both crowds in a room and say like you were at a happy hour and you were talking to you had a parts and a service person talking, what would you have the parts person ask that technician? Or like, what do you think a parts person is really curious about that they don't ask? That's a really broad and tough question.
Yeah, I didn't talk about this. What would
Like the reason I ask that is I think there's times where if you have that really standoffish tech that doesn't want to talk to you, it can be really, really frustrating. And so rather than try to hit the conflict in the face and try to address things and be really forward, where I think it would go is right back to the communication side. It's like, why are you, like, it's almost like a husband and wife relationship where like, why are you approaching that situation that way? Or why are you coming at me for no reason? Like I want to help you. That would be my guess is that, yeah. Like I know why you need the part. I know that you do need the part. And we're trying to deliver that to you, but why can't we just have a normal conversation? And I feel like a lot of parts people would think that way.
Yeah, I agree. So I think, yeah, going back to the communication and understanding, like, it's so important to understand the different personalities of people and identifying, that if they're a high D or an A or however, there's so many different personality tests out there, but
yeah,
they're generally all the same, and just kind of understanding when that person and how to communicate differently with that person, I think is huge with anything in business. So, I don't know if that totally answers the question, but
it does. I think at the end of the day, everything we've talked about circles back to communication, right? And that it's such an easy thing to talk about, but such a hard thing to do. And especially when it comes to a parts and service person or having.
Well, and they don't totally work side by side. So you don't know if that person's dog died, probably, like, you just don't know. So it's like just taking the time, I guess, to build those relationships to understand if that person's having a bad day or something personally happened, because we're allowed to, be affected by what goes on in our personal lives. Of course,
100%.
We need to shut it out at some point, but not shut it out, but you have to maintain some level of professionalism. But we're all working together, and we all need to kind of understand when someone's having a bad day.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's really true in anything, but I think technicians, and again, I don't want to put all technicians in the same boat, but there are times where, our upbringing was a little different, and that we were, suck it up, move on, like,
Oh yeah.
it's hard to get that understanding, and especially when you've been raised that way, it can be a challenge. So I think that's true. One last thing I would say there on that topic or on that point is, and this goes for techs in how they view service managers, techs in how they view fixed ops directors, techs on how they view parts managers, in that they see the person sitting behind the computer all day doing this, and they're like, oh, great, they're on Facebook again, or they're doing whatever. But it truly is, it's computer work, it's behind a screen. And I think at times maybe the perception from a technician's end is that they're not doing anything, they're just sitting behind a computer. And
Yeah.
that couldn't be any further from the truth.
Mm-mm. If you're a parts manager, if you walk into their office and there's piles and there's stuff everywhere, they're not just sitting behind the computer doing nothing. Because I think that stuff would probably be organized. Knowing most parts managers are very detailed and organized people, so yeah.
But there's some level of insecurity there, I feel like, with a parts manager, and them, if they know that technician's perception is that, and they're sitting behind their computer, I do think there's something that, can mentally take your focus off of what you're doing because you're worried about what that person thinks. And,
Yeah.
I that goes so much further into the psychology of it. But I also think it's valid. Like, I think people, they worry about what their perception is. And if they know that technician thinks I'm not doing anything, that's where the numbers can really help out and say, hey, you want to know, like, what I'm doing behind here? If I don't do this, this number is going to do this. Or if I don't, like, explaining what you do is so important.
Include the techs on those inventory meetings that you have, so they can understand the impact that they're having on things.
Yeah.
Going back to communication.
It is. This ultimately, I mean, it is about communication, and even from the parts manager side, using a tool like PartsEdge to help you manage the inventory. So maybe you can get up from behind the computer a little bit more and be proactive in training your parts staff on how to work with a service department, and not that it's just, your job isn't just to go drop the part and you're good, but grow that relationship. It's just as important on the parts person's end as it is the technician's end. And I think a lot of times the parts person is open to it, but then if they get shut down right away, then they just don't pursue the relationship whatsoever. Mm-hmm. So if you can train them on how to get feedback from a tech, how to take that feedback and take it to the parts manager. So if you've got maybe a person that is actually delivering parts to a stall, or is directly interacting with all the technicians, that they know how to take the feedback that they get and communicate it back to the parts manager in an effective way. Because I think there's another barrier there, where if a parts person tells it to, or a tech tells it to the parts person, and the parts person just says, that person just bitches all the time. They don't like it, so they don't take it anywhere, but it's an actual valid concern. I think being able to take constructive criticism is really important too.
Yeah, and it's kind of up to the managers to create that dynamic for the departments too. Like if you have a fixed ops manager, create that dynamic so that they can easily build those relationships. So
yeah, super important. At the end of the day, it comes down to communication. I think it's just like any relationship. You hit on a couple really, really good points on differences in personalities. A personality of a parts person can be drastically different than that of a service person. And therein lies a lot of the problem of why we've got silos in the first place, and why when you go to the company Christmas party, all the parts people sit together and all the service people sit together. I've gone to Christmas parties where I'm like, this is like a 8th grade dance. Like there's like, it's like everybody's in their own little worlds. But
oh yeah, I've seen it.
So if you want a good idea or a good understanding of how well those relationships are working. See how people interact when they're in a social setting, because that can tell you a lot about how close your departments are. And I think most people, when they look up, yeah, have a party. It's a great excuse to have a party. But it also, I think it tells you so much about how people interact. And if they just don't interact in a social setting, probably means they're not wanting to talk to each other at work either. So if you can kind of identify that and then coach, be a leader, be a manager, and help bridge those relationships, because that's our whole conversation was about communication and relationships. It's really important, and like if you don't do that, you're not going to get any better.
No, and putting yourself in the other person's shoes, I think, is huge. Understanding what they're going through, what their role is. It's just like, don't be one-sided. Be open.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great advice. I think that's great advice for any position in a dealership, but specifically the parts and service departments. I think asking the right questions can help a service person understand the parts department and really help them be able to put themselves in those shoes. So really, really good conversation here. I've enjoyed this. I think it's something that from my personal background, I've struggled with the relationship between parts and service for a long time. From what I hear from industry, I don't think I'm alone. I think there's a lot of improvement to be had in that regard.
Definitely. I look forward to talking about it more.
Good. So Kaylee, how do people get in touch with you?
They can, if they want to learn about PartsEdge, just go to the website. It's just partsedge.com. And then just my email or info@PartsEdge. I don't know. We could probably include it in some sort of
We'll put it in the show link so people can get in touch with you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. As always, a joy to talk to you, and look forward to doing it again.
Thanks so much.